So, identity is one of the most compelling digital public infrastructure building block. So, just one building block, it is not enough for many transformation to come, but it is a very powerful and foundational ID, because no digital service or no service can be provided or availed without proving who you are. So, the ID has always caught the imagination of nations even before digital, right. Every nation, every system has some sort of an ID, whether it is a national ID, local, province or state driven identities, functional identities like I have a doctor ID or a farmer ID and so on, or even employee ID. Half the time when we join a company, they would generate an identity number, they would give you an ID card, employee ID card and all that thing. So, identity is a very what you call foundational in anything that you want to do. But there exists some confusion. Typically when I speak to people, I do realize there exists some confusion about digital ID. So, when countries navigate towards a digital ID, there are sometimes there are some myths that come with it. Myth number one, a digital ID needs to be built all over again. That means I need to rebuild a completely new fresh system to actually get a digital ID. That is a myth, actually wrong. Second, you need to remove all the existing IDs and make one new ID in replacing. So, replacing existing identities to create one, that is myth number two. Myth number three is that ID necessitates a costly card, chip on card, sort of hologram and all the traditionally complex and expensive ideas. These three myths are highly prevailing. So, let us talk about the first one. Why do I say that rolling out a digital identity does not necessitate that you to rebuild a completely fresh identity system from scratch? Very high chance, and we come across this in many countries. A country already has some sort of an identity, traditional identity. Maybe it is in physical form, the form factor might be digital, but maybe it is covered, 90% of the people may be already covered, or 95% may be covered, maybe 100% covered. Then we wonder, why is this country trying to build yet another digital ID system? So, this myth that digital ID needs a new system, I want to talk to you about today, a little bit about why it is not required. If there is an existing physical ID, foundational ID, physical ID exists, you can convert it to a verifiable digital token of sort by putting a QR code, digitally signed QR code, or making it available on a smartphone and things like that. You can actually convert, simply a thin layer, convert a physical identity which you painfully gave to large number of population, but convert them to a digitally verifiable credential, identity credential. And that layering does not require costly, fresh rebuild, and most importantly, it does not require the whole citizen, everybody coming back and standing in line again to re-enroll, because this myth is very common and we continue to see it. So, remember, if you have a physical ID today, ask yourself, why can't I simply layer a digital credential on top of that physical layer through digitally signed QR code or smartphone credential, physical digital credential? Wouldn't that suffice? You should ask this question. It is an important question to ask. Suddenly you might say, of course, if that works, I do not need to do any of this expensive exercise of re-enrolling the whole population with a new system, doing RFPs and all that thing, right. So, it is very important that you actually ask this question, myth number one. Myth number two is you have to collapse all the new ID has to replace all the existing ID, and that's another myth. It's a bad positioning in every way. When India, for example, looked at it, foundational ID, it was strengthening the existing identifiers or identity. If you have a driver's license, if you have a passport, if you have a national ID, if you have food security ID or healthcare identities and other identities that are already in the system, you should ask the question, can this foundational identity, digitally verifiable foundational identity, simply strengthen this identity and not replace? What's the difference? Is that a functional identity like a food identity or identity given for tax purposes or identity given for health purposes has more attributes because it's functional in nature. So, I have to capture more attributes there. Imagine if you take 5 functional identities and try to collapse them, your identity become a superset of all these attributes, and that's not minimalism. That's not completely against the DPI thinking. And worst case, you will have a political battle with all these departments who already are issuing identity like driver's license or other identities will oppose you, because they would say, we already have an ID. What are you trying to do? Are you trying to replace us? Are you trying to do what we are already doing? So, I think it is a smart thing to imagine a foundational identity as just a minimum identity, just to say who you are. That's all you need to do, like GPS, it says where you are, identity to say who you are, nothing more. Make sure that ID system is digitally verifiable, and then it allows the functional ID issuers like a driver's license or other issuance to use this to onboard customers onto their system faster, cheaper, but then they verify the entitlement to drive or entitlement to receive food. They have to do all those additional verification, and they will issue a functional ID. Let them issue a functional ID. So, myth number 2 is thinking identity as a replacement strategy and not strengthening strategy. So, the foundational ID should strengthen other identities, not replace other identities, to make it minimal and faster, cheaper rollout. Again, DPI thinking is very key. And the last one is the myth that you need digital, means you need some chip, card, hologram and all the traditional manifestation of a security manifestation. I think it is most countries would agree today, most people will agree today, if you are 2024, if you are rolling out an ID, you don't need any of those. You can actually issue a digital identity that is verifiable without a card form factor of a card or a chip on a card. Now, you can give some PVC or really low expensive stuff to carry around, because people need to carry something around. But you don't need expensive chip or holograms and other security matters, because security comes from the signature and digital signature and verifiability, and security does not come from the form factor. So, you don't need to embed security into expensive form factor, make security in the design of the verifiability. So, that way I don't care what you are carrying around, you can carry an A4 sheet, it is still verifiable. So, the form factor become less important than the verifiability aspect of the ID. So, get away from the form factor. I have to procure cards, I have to issue cards and expensive cards and all that thing, because it's just a waste of money, waste of time. It does take an enormous energy out of the system. Now, some people might want to issue some cards, but let it be an add-on feature and don't make it a necessary component of the ID, right. This is the 3 myths I talked about. But when you design an identity, and I would talk about that as well, what do you mean by digital ID? Digital identity is about identity is represented digitally and verified digitally, but doesn't mean it is carried around digitally. That is a very, very important part of that. That is, people ask this question to me a lot of times. Oh, so does digital ID create a digital divide? what happens to people who have no smartphone? How can digital ID work? And my answer to them is digital ID does not mean the form factor need to be digital. It can be phygital. You can print an identity in an A4 sheet or a small PVC or whatever form factor you want with a digitally signed QR code, making it verifiable natively. Hand over the paper to the person who has no smartphone. So people can walk around with a paper-based credential, ID credential, but the person who is accepting this ID can now verify digitally. So the verifiability is digital, the representation is digital, but the form factor need not be digital. And this is very important. This allows you to do two things. One, it allows you to include people who have no smartphones into an identity world without a digital divide. So in an inclusive design necessitates that the ID is represented digitally, verified digital, but it can be printed and manifested in physical forms. That allows inclusion. And very important, very less known fact is that most digital identities, when represented through a signed QR code, can actually work completely offline. And this is another myth, right? Identity, digital ID requires connectivity. And most people say, I don't have connectivity in my country. So what is the use of digital ID? India did not have connectivity for the first 4 years when we were rolling out, first 2-3 years. Much of India was still on 2G, barely connected. So, but we were still making it verifiable. So it is important to understand the identity can be inclusive and can work online and offline if you design it as a mere digital representation of the credential. So overall, to summarize, the 3 myths, you should be very careful about falling into this 3 myths trap. Myth number 1 is that digital ID requires completely new system, remove everything exists, let's start all over again, let's get everybody standing in line. Myth number 1. Myth number 2, you need to replace all the identities and come with one mega ID. Bad myth. Third one, it requires significant physical cost of issuance because it's digital. So you need a chip on card or things like that, and that is a myth. And most importantly, you can design a digital ID that is natively digital and verifiable digital, but a fully inclusive, online, offline, inclusive way. And if you get this essence of this ID, I think we can see a lot of countries very quickly rolling out digital ID without necessarily falling through these myths and digital versus physical confusions that I talked about. So now that we have the digital ID, you can ask this question, now the country has digital ID, what are the additional layers you can do? And these layers need not be done, maybe should not be done by the person who is providing identity. So you can even do different people in the ecosystem, different departments or different institutions can provide layered services on top of ID. And the 3 very key layered services that we can talk about, 3 key services that very quickly that you can bring it over, 3 or 4 I would talk about. 1, you can very easily roll out a national single sign-on service for many of the government sites. So the single sign-on is where you have one ID, log in, it doesn't matter which department I am dealing with, I can log in once, one click, like a Google login, right? It's like that you can actually log in. So look for that opportunity. Look for that opportunity to deliver in your country a single sign-on authentication service connecting to multitude of ID system, including foundational ID system as a layered service. Don't fuse a single sign-on into the ID service, because then ID become no more minimal. Then no more a DPI. So keep the ID just ID. It is issued digitally, it is verifiable digitally, that's it. Then let somebody else build a national single sign-on service, make it very easy, and single sign-on need not be attached to citizenship. You have many foreigners who may be living in the country. They can also get a single sign-on service, maybe attached to their passport. So you can attach single sign-on with a verifiability behind it, multiple IDs as a verifiable ID. Okay? So single sign-on is a very powerful layered service, very thin, simple, easy to do. Second thing you can do is verifiable credential and wallet strategy. That means ID becomes the impetus or the starting point for you to now say ID is already credentialized. Now what else can we credentialize? We can credentialize functional IDs like driver's licenses and other functional IDs. We can credentialize certificates like academic certificate, trade licenses and many other things. So look for that opportunity, a +1 opportunity to roll out a credentialing infrastructure very quickly as a layered service. And the third one I will talk about is functional registries. Look for other than foundational ID, there are many systems where master data of companies, master data of people like farmers, master data of teachers in the education system, master data of doctors in the healthcare system, all this data is maintained in databases today in silo, but they are not reusable. So if you want a list of doctors, you will build it all over again in your database, whereas the health ministry might already have a list of doctors. So look for functional registries of various actors, companies and people in the various actors in various silo system today. Look for opportunity to convert them into a open API based digital public good, a digital public infrastructure. When you convert it to a DPI, suddenly the next healthcare system you are building don't have to rebuild the doctor database also all over again, or next agriculture solution you are building, you don't have to build farmer registry all over again. So convert functional registries into a DPI. That means don't leave it into a silo database, make it a reusable building block. And the way you do that is open an API and also give a credential back to the farmer or the doctor so that they can reuse it other places. This is the third very easy layer. And the fourth layer is G2P mapper. You create, now that you have an identity, you have bank accounts, create an ID to bank account mapper. That allows suddenly many G2P programs, whether it's climate resilience program, healthcare programs, food security programs that you might be benefits you are delivering, you can now deliver to an identity instead of directly to a bank account or a mobile wallet account. So identity becomes an alias for your financial address, and that allows you to move from one bank to other bank. Maybe you start with a mobile wallet account, later you open a bank account. You as a citizen can do all that thing and continue to receive money because money is being sent to the ID and not to the final bank account. These four are layered services quite easily that you can actually layer on top of ID. Doesn't mean you put all this into ID system. Okay, please remember this. These should be layered by different Ministry of Transformation, Ministry of IT, other departments can actually roll this out.